Welcome to the wonderful world of wine, exploring all things wine with you. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lenzi, and you can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. And this week we have our annual installment of What to Serve with the Bird. But we have a little bit of a twist on it this year, don't we, Mark?
Yeah. First off, I can't believe it's already Thanksgiving, Kim.
I know.
But I like we have this is a tradition for us on the show. Our listeners hopefully know with the what to serve with the bird. And we had mentioned earlier in the show that Kim had some new beer certifications and has been teaching beer classes. And I thought maybe this year we should kind of reverse. If you like a certain wine, how can you pair these things with a beer? So just going to hit Kim with a bunch of questions. We're going to go through some foods and beers and switch it up a little bit this year, Kim.
Yeah, I love it. Not to say that wine doesn't go perfectly wonderfully with our Thanksgiving meal, but some people in your family, in your group, maybe is not a wine drinker. Maybe they're a beer drinker instead. So just to give some ideas and kind of shake it up a little bit and add some variety to our Thanksgiving table.
Yeah, and it's a great time of year for wine as the holidays come. We're drinking a lot more of it with family and friends. But like you said, maybe your family or friends like beer better, but you're a wine drinker and you don't know what to get them or serve them. So we're hoping this will tackle that issue, Kim, today. The first thing I had to ask you, though, Kim, is we talk all the time about pairing wine and food. When we talk about beer now, are there like different or similar things to talk about for beer? Like, are we talking body? Are we talking acidity? Are we talking sweetness? What are the things we should look for when pairing foods with beer?
So there are some very different textural things that go on in wine that are different from what go on in beer. But the main idea, the main concept behind food and wine pairings and beer and wine pairings are the same. And that is try to match the weight of the food and the weight of the beverage. So we talk about lighter beverages with lighter foods, heavier beverages with heavier foods. So for wine, this comes down to kind of the concept of, oh, you wouldn't want to pair a very light, delicate fish dish with a really big, hearty red wine because you're going to be out of balance. And that poor wine is going to get completely lost up against that really heavy food. And vice versa. You don't want to do a too heavy of a food dish with too light of a wine dish. Sorry, did I say that backwards? In any case, you want to
heavy food. You don't want heavy food with light wine. You said
exactly,
it right.
Exactly. And the same holds true for beer. If you have a very light beer, it can get overwhelmed by a heavier dish. And there are some heavier beers out there that can overpower some of our lighter food dishes. So, that concept remains the same. So looking at the weight, looking at the balance, and just trying to make that match. But we also talk about matching certain elements in wines with food, whether it be the spiciness of a wine and the spiciness of a food, which I know you like to do, Mark, and making sure that like acidity is in balance and you don't have a really sweet food with a dry wine. So all of those things are similar when it comes to beer pairings as it does for wine pairings. The major difference between pairing wine with food and beer with food is that wine has acidity that is generally lacking in most beers. There are some exceptions. We do have some sour beers out there, but overall, acidity is what gives a lot of wine its balance and its structure, especially when it comes to white wines. Because beer does not have that, the equivalent component in most beers is bitterness. So we are working the acid angle when it comes to wine, and we are working the bitter angle when it comes to beer. So that's kind of the big main structural difference, I feel like, between the two beverages that we have to work with when it comes to pairing food.
So in the wine world, we can find out some of that information with the tech sheets or shelf talkers or something. With beer, you mentioned bitterness. Is that what they call the IBU?
Yeah, so there is a correlation between IBUs and bitterness. It's not always a one-to-one equivalency, but generally generally, the lower the IBUs, the less bitter the beer is going to be. And the higher the IBUs, the more bitter it's going to be. But you can also look at particular styles because some styles of beer are just naturally more bitter than others. So IPAs, pale ales, those are going to be more on the bitter side of the spectrum, whereas our wheat beers, our lighter pilsners, things like that are going to be on the less bitter side of that scale.
Okay, that's good information.
Yeah,
And all beers also have an alcohol percent, which I'm sure plays into body and weight of a beer,
absolutely.
just like
Yep.
wine, correct?
Yep.
Good. Okay, so we have some pairing background. So now let's start. The first thing I wanted to ask him is people coming over for Thanksgiving. First thing we kind of do in my house, we hand them, what do you like to drink, right? With no food, there's nothing on the table, just welcoming them with guests. And you're the bubbly queen, and I'm sure you like to start things out with the sparkling. What is a
Always.
beer suggestion for someone first who loves bubbly to greet somebody, and then just a simple beer to start the party rolling? People
hmm
coming in the door, what would you suggest?
So my recommendation for a beer for those bubbly lovers in your life, me being one of them, if you wanted to roll out something a little bit special, and this is my sort of champagne equivalency or sparkling wine equivalency for beer drinkers, is a saison from Belgium. These do have a little bit more bitterness to them, but a lot of them are bottle conditioned in the bottle. So they're actually beers that are made in a fairly similar manner to champagne. So they have their second fermentation take place in the bottle, and they have this wonderful dryness, again, a little bit of that bitterness, but because of the yeast that is used, they have a lot of really beautiful aromatics and a really, really good bubble. So I recommend Belgian saisons for sparkling wine lovers if they want to try a beer that is maybe more attuned to their palate and those kinds of things that they like. They do have a lot of complexity to them. I just think that they're really interesting and really cool. But if
So
you wanted
those
to,
those
so
usually come in bigger size bottle, right? Are
yeah,
they
with like
crown
a
cap
champagne cork.
or are they
Sometimes a
yeah.
crown cap, sometimes a champagne cork. You can kind of find them both ways, but you do need to be careful when you're pouring them because they may have a little bit of a sediment at the bottom of the bottle because of that bottle conditioning. So treat it like you would any other specialty beer that might have some sediment on the bottom. Same way you would treat an older bottle of wine that maybe has thrown some sediment, and you get that almost kind of looks like coffee grinds at the bottom of a bottle of, say, like an older Cabernet or something like that. You don't want to drink that, so leave that at the bottom of the bottle.
And a little bit more carbonation than typical beer.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yep.
Okay, great. All right. So we welcome the people at our Thanksgiving feast. Now we'll move on to the appetizers, Kim. And first, I want to start with cheese. And we always say wine and cheese, classic pairing in the food pairing world, right? So,
hmm
what is something for beer that we can pair with cheese that would be comparable to some sort of wine we would pair with cheese?
So for a cheese pairing, I actually go kind of lighter, and you can have a beer with a little bit of bitterness to it. I generally, for this course, would go with something fairly mild and neutral. Usually things in the lager category go really well. So something like a Stella Artois, which is an international pale lager. We have a number of really, really nice things out of Germany. In particular, we have a particular style from Munich that most of the Oktoberfest producers also make, which is called a Helles, Helles, which is this light, kind of floral, aromatic, lightly malty, just beautiful bitterness that I think is really excellent with cheese. It's a really nice food beer. It appeals to, I think, people who like something that is light but balanced and has these really pretty aromatics to it. So that actually makes a fantastic cheese pairing beer.
Sounds good. Does it
Yeah,
matter if
doesn't
the
it?
cheese is like something that's a warm, like fondue cheese versus cold cheese when you're doing beer?
Ooh, they both go well. I mean, when you think about fondue in Central Europe, you're not drinking wine with that. You're drinking beer with that. So
Yeah,
it's kind
right,
of a
right.
classic pairing for that.
Nice. Okay, so next app I had a question on, Kim, was soups. And traditionally, Thanksgiving, they say like a butternut squash soup.
Yeah, that's what we do.
So what would you suggest for a beer with that type of appetizer?
So you can start going a little bit more forceful in the flavors. I think what I like for creamy soups are wit beers. So Belgian wit beers, sometimes they're called white beers. We have a number of domestically produced ones that are really excellent. Ommegang makes a really lovely wit. We have a number of things from here in New England, including Allagash, that their wit beer is really excellent. And I've had both of these with creamy soups and bisques and things like that. And it really is a wonderful pairing. So something that has a nice, refreshing character. It's not particularly bitter. These are really not a bitter style. But because of the yeastiness of the beer, that brightness cuts through some of the either creaminess of the soup or richness, depending on what the ingredients are in there. And they really make a very nice balanced pairing because it's refreshing. You know, it kind of like cleanses the palate after that rich soup.
Is that the same style as the Sam Adams white ale that comes out this time of year?
It's similar. I think the white ale has additional spices that are added to it. Sam does a lot of spiced beers in the wintertime. So a lot of their cold weather beers will have a lot of additional ingredients added that actually are traditional in a lot of parts of Europe. This tradition of making spiced winter beers goes back a long ways. But I remember the white ale from last year. I'm pretty sure it had some other kind of spice notes to it, but that's also fairly typical because Belgian wits will usually use orange peel and coriander and some other things. So yeah, so that would be, you know, a similar style.
It sounds like it would be a great pairing for that
Am I
soup
making you
with
hungry
that
yet?
spice. Yeah, yeah. All right. So next app we want to talk about is salads. And typically when we talked about this in the wine world, we're saying we want something with some acidity to play off maybe on the dressing of a salad. What would you do for beer with your typical salad?
So this is where that kind of disconnect between wine and beer comes in, where we don't have the acidity in beer. We have the bitterness to make up for it. So I would do definitely a lager style, these kind of lighter styles of lager, either Pilsner style from Germany or Czechoslovakia. German pils have this nice cleansing bitterness to them that would work particularly well with a high acid kind of dressing, or a pale ale. So we're starting to move into these styles that are a little more hop driven, a little more bitter because of the amount of hops that are used in the brewing of the beer. So we can start to get into those beers that do have more of that forward bitterness as part of their profile, as opposed to kind of the yeastiness or the maltiness of some of these other beers.
So if a wine lover likes tannic red wines, will they like bitter beers?
I think so, because tannins do have a bitter element to them. We have this astringency that sometimes we associate with highly tannic reds, and that is a bitter component. So I do tend to recommend for red wine drinkers to either to try both directions, either go for these more aggressively bitter beers or to go with a darker beer. So darker beers are brewed with darker malts. We get a darker color from them. They're not necessarily more bitter. I know you might look at a pint of Guinness and be like, "Oh my God, that thing is going to be really heavy." But they're not necessarily heavier beers. They're just darker and they have more aromas and flavors that are reminiscent of more like toasty things. So like toasted bread and roasted nuts and coffee and chocolate and things like that. So either approach those darker, more malty flavors or go the bitter route. So it's an individual choice, but I would suggest that folks who are red wine drinkers and like that extra weight, that extra heaviness in their wine, experiment with a couple of different of those bigger styles and see if you like them.
I like that you mentioned Guinness because my last appetizer was something that was a tradition when I grew up is you had this big pile of nuts on the table that no one ever touched.
It's such
Almonds,
an Italian thing.
yeah, all those weird looking hazel, whatever they were, I never touched them. You had the nutcracker there, you cracked them and no one ate them. But would a Guinness work? Like usually for nuts in the wine world, we're talking like tawny port, something like a more
Yeah.
dessert style. Would that Guinness, that toastiness, I was just thinking if I
Yeah.
had an almond and I drank a Guinness, I think that would be a great pairing. Would that where you would
I
go?
actually think that nuts and beer are a better pairing than nuts and wine because there is so much of that toasty, roasty quality in so many beers. Anything that is like a coppery color on up will have malts as part of the recipe that have been more highly kilned, more highly cooked. So they do have these flavors that are reminiscent of like bread crust and toast and maybe caramel and all of these other kind of darker, more cooked flavors. It's one of the reasons why you see beer nuts on the bar. When you go
Yeah.
to a bar and you're sitting there and you're sipping your pint, you're just sort of naturally eating the nuts that are on the bar and they go really well. So it's not only you've got the fat in the nuts, you've got the toasty flavors, you've got the salt, like all that stuff goes really, really well.
I always thought that had something to do with the salt.
I think it is salt too, but there is this it's a good kind of meeting of similar flavors when you're talking
Yeah,
about these browner beers and our nuts.
and
The
Guinness
other stuff,
surprisingly
sorry,
low. No, I'm sorry. The Guinness is surprisingly low in alcohol too. A lot of
yeah.
people think it's heavy, it's high alcohol, but it's only like 4.5, five
It's
percent, right? It's
not.
low.
Yeah, it's low. It's under 5. I've seen some Irish stouts that are like 5.5, but yeah, it's not a high alcohol beer. And it's not usually very full bodied either. You know, you look at that black color and you're like, oh my God, this thing is going to be heavy. But it's really not. It's fairly light on your tongue. Like if you were to taste it with your eyes closed and not know what you were tasting, you would be surprised at how light it actually feels without you looking at the color.
Nice. You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine, and we are your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. You can find more information about Kim on her website, commonwealthwineschool.com. For more information about myself, you can go to franklinliquors.com. Our program is supported by Franklin Public Radio. You can find our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes, and you can find us for questions and feedback on the show on Facebook, The Wonderful World of Wine. So today it's all about what to serve with the bird, but this year we're doing a little different and talking beer for wine lovers. So you have someone that comes to your house and you're a wine drinker this Thanksgiving, you can surprise them with some of these beer suggestions from Kim. We talked about what to greet them with, some appetizer recommendations. Now, Kim, we have to move on to the bird, the turkey. And every year we talk about the Beaujolais Nouveau coming out. We talk about Pinot Noir being the wine for turkey. What can we compare for beer to like Beaujolais Nouveau, something grapey, something fruity, and Pinot Noir, something light? What would work for beer with the turkey?
So, whereas I feel like for heavier red wines, we have a number of things that would be kind of an equivalent. It's a little harder with our lighter reds, but I do have some suggestions for kind of middle of the road weight beers that will be particularly good with food. I have a style that is the best of both worlds for me. It is aromatic, but it's also a little toasty, so it can stand up to food. And that is the Dunkelweiss. This is a German beer that is a darker beer. It's brown in color, but it's made with wheat. So it kind of smells like a toasty Hefeweizen, and it is excellent with food. It's aromatic, which we tend to recommend a lot of aromatic wines to go with the Thanksgiving meal. So often we'll be talking about Gewürztraminer and dry Riesling and those Beaujolais, which have that big, pretty, fruity red nose. This is a beer that has a lot of aromatics to it. And although the aroma and flavor profiles are very different than our fruity wines, this is more malty and yeasty. I think that it hits all the same points that we are looking for in those wines that we choose. It hits a lot of different things as far as we get this fruity element from the yeast. We also get this toasty element from the malt. It's not very bitter, but it is refreshing. So it's something that I find is a really excellent food wine. And the thing about Thanksgiving dinner is that you have a lot of different things on the table. So you want something that would go with a whole bunch of different things. And I think that this style of beer will work particularly well. I also like to recommend recommend New England IPAs, again, for their aromatics. So we have this style that is very, very popular here in New England. It was kind of started on the Vermont home brewing or craft brewing scene, where it uses a lot of hop, but more for their aromas and less for their bitterness. So it's a hazy, almost creamy style. It smells like tropical fruit and pine trees and citrus and all of these really lovely fruity things. So it's kind of my wine that I recommend for Sauvignon Blanc drinkers, because a lot of the aromatics are sharing a profile with what you get out of the glass of a Sauvignon Blanc. You know, you get this kind of passion fruit, citrus, grapefruit kind of a thing. And New England IPAs cover a lot of that. So that is my secondary recommendation for kind of the main beer to have at the table for Thanksgiving.
You covered a lot of worldwide beers, and
I did. I know.
I was thinking Thanksgiving. Is there any history Pilgrims having any alcohol or beer or wine on Thanksgiving?
Beer,
I've never.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Beer, yes. I don't know about at the first Thanksgiving, because agriculture hadn't really been established yet. So there really wasn't any grains to speak of in order to make beer out of.
Maybe the Indians had the corn. You know,
corn's a little harder to ferment, but you can ferment lots of different fruits and things. So, you know, you can ferment pumpkin puree. Colonial America was more about cider than it was about beer. So, I mean, the Pilgrims they were before colonial America, but if you're talking about, you know, what was traditionally consumed by colonial Americans, say around the time of the American Revolution, we were drinking cider and we were drinking homebrewed beer. And if there was any wine that was being drunk, it had to have survived the passage from Europe. So at that point, it was fortified wines like port, like Madeira, like sherry. So our domestic production at that point was whiskey and cider and beer.
Yeah, cider's big this time of year.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would recommend also cider for Thanksgiving. We're bringing a few bottles of cider with us to Thanksgiving this year.
That's a whole other show.
That's a whole other show.
More information.
Yeah.
Sticking with the main dish, we did the turkey. I have to ask you, the second main dish, of course, for us, Kim, is pasta. And wine lovers, we're always having Chianti with pasta. What is the Chianti in the beer world that works with pasta?
Ooh.
Red sauce.
I don't know. I don't do beer with pasta.
Really?
No, I can't.
I mean, pizza. What do you have with pizza?
Oh, beer
for
with pizza. That's true. I do whatever the heck I feel like doing.
Anything goes with
anything
it, right?
goes with pizza. I mean, it's kind of that way with wine too, right? I mean, anything goes with pizza.
Yeah.
Pizza is the perfect food. Really.
Well, so anything with the pasta. All right. So now we'll move on to the sides, because I have a question when we talk about wines and side dishes, stuffing and sweet potatoes, things like that. We always talk about wines that have a little bit of earthiness to them. So if we're talking potatoes and stuffing, well, let's stay with stuffing because that could be more earthy stuff. What would you pair with an earthy dish that's beer related?
So we do have some kind of funkier, earthier beers from Belgium that utilize a secondary species of yeast called Brettanomyces that you do find in wine. It gives this kind of almost gamey, sometimes smells like animals. In a good way, you know, on a farm, hay, things like that. But Brettanomyces in beer gives this more, I think, pleasant earthiness to the beer. So we have a number of really interesting things out of Belgium. We could go back to that Saison that we started the party with for our sparkling wine drinkers. So that is one that has a little bit of that earthiness to it. But also our Trappist beers are beers that were traditionally brewed in monasteries by monks. So we've got triples and doubles and strong golden ales. Those will often have a bit of an earthy element to them. So a Belgian double for something that has maybe mushrooms or the toastiness of stuffing, that pairing would be really, really nice.
Yeah, that sounds good. Now let's move on to something that's more of a buttery or creamy that goes with potatoes. You have a big chunk of butter on your potatoes this Thanksgiving, and we usually pair that with some sort of creamy Chardonnay to bring out that butteriness. Is there a beer that's comparable to Chardonnay to bring out the butteriness of a side dish like potatoes or butter in
So there
general.
are there are some oak barrel aged beers out there. So there are a number of things that American producers will be very creative in their brewing. So for something that has maybe bourbon barrel aging, there's a lot of really interesting things out there from American brewers. But if we wanted to stick again to our sort of traditional Belgian beers, the Belgian triples are actually this kind of golden color and have this rich, almost creaminess to them because they're a little bit higher in alcohol. So they have the weight from the alcohol, but they also sometimes will have a little bit of sediment in there. They're certainly not a light, shy beer by any stretch of the imagination, but they would cut through the richness of, a big buttery mashed potato really well. So for in small quantities, because they do kind of get up there in their alcohol content, we're kind of looking at 7-8% sometimes with some of these Belgian triples. But that's my recommendation for folks who like white wines with more body and maybe some buttery creaminess to them.
Nice. All right, so we covered the sides. Now let's move on to my favorite Thanksgiving desserts, Kim.
You and dessert.
In the wine world, we say the wine should be as sweet or sweeter than the dessert. Is that similar for beer pairings with dessert?
We don't have a lot of sweet beers out there, believe it or not. There are a few, especially fruit beers that you can find, raspberry beers, peach beers. There are lambics from Europe that have both acidity and sweetness from fruit. So if you're doing a fruit dessert, like a pie, I think that one of those would work well. But if you are doing something like pecan pie, or maybe apple pie could work, pumpkin or chocolate, something that's a little bit richer, you actually can go with one of these darker, more malty beers, and that would work pretty well. A lot of people will do stout and chocolate, and it's actually really good, especially with milk chocolate. So Irish stout and milk chocolate are a surprisingly good combination. And I am not as people know who have listened to the show for a really long time, I am not a dry beverage with sweet food kind of person, but those darker, maltier beers that have those notes of coffee and chocolate in them go really well with chocolate. So that would be
Nice.
my recommendation. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
mentioned
Do.
you mentioned pumpkin pie, and a lot of times it can come off as an earthy type dessert. Again, would you play it the same way as the earthy side with the pumpkin pie, or what
Yeah,
would
but
you try to
I
bring
wouldn't do
out?
but I wouldn't do a dark beer with it. I would do a lighter colored beer. So like a Belgian strong golden ale would work really nicely with pumpkin.
And you mentioned something earlier about the spice beers that come out this time of year. I
Yeah,
think that would
yeah,
bring out the cinnamon and the clove
absolutely.
and the spice. So
Yeah. And that's the nice thing about having such a vibrant local beer scene is that almost all of the breweries in our area and in listener, whatever area you happen to be in, if you have local breweries, chances are they will be making some seasonal beers. So there will probably be pumpkin beers. There will probably be spiced ales. There might even be like wassail style beers that have cinnamon and clove and things like that in them. And those will work really nicely with anything that has that kind of spice element in the dessert.
there's actually a lot of domestic beer producers now that are making apple flavored beers on
Ah,
the lower
apples
grade
apples
beers. Like,
trendy now, huh?
yeah, but inexpensive beers. I totally not thinking of the pumpkin beer with the pumpkin pie.
Yeah,
It's
could
just
work.
so unfortunately, the way the brewers do the beer, seasonal beers, pumpkin beers are usually gone by Halloween. So they're
Yeah.
hard to find at Thanksgiving. It's because all the Christmas stuff is out, all the holiday beers. So
Yeah. So you got to lay in some pumpkin beer
yeah.
in the fall. Your beer will still be fine by Christmas. If it's in a can, it'll be good. If it's in a bottle, keep it someplace away from light.
Okay, so now Thanksgiving is over. Next day, we have our leftovers. We always like talking about the turkey sandwiches, the turkey soup. We usually say and suggest rosé for these
Hmm.
leftovers, a perfect little thing for a turkey sandwich. What is the perfect leftover beer food pairing for turkeys?
I'm gonna go back to our kind of lighter colored pale beers, whether it's a pale colored lager or whether it's a pale ale. Something refreshing because you've got a lot going on in, say, that Thanksgiving sandwich. You've got one bite that has all of these things and probably also, mayonnaise or cheese or whatever you like to put on your sandwich. So I want to do something refreshing that has some bitterness that's going to cut through all the fattiness in that sandwich. And I love a day after Thanksgiving sandwich. And I think a lighter style lager is absolutely perfect with those.
All right. Now I want to ask you a couple cooking questions, or one cooking question that's been on
Sure.
my mind. Any Thanksgiving dish that you cook with beer, and the reason I bring this up is because there's always the famous beer can chicken, but I've never heard of beer can turkey. Is there any dish
Because
that...
you can't stand up a turkey on a beer can. It's just
Oh,
too
you
big
got
of
a
a bird.
two-pounder. Is that the whole? No, that's the whole reason. Because they're so big.
Yeah,
You
because it's
couldn't
so
do that?
big. Yeah, because you have to stand the bird up on the beer can. That thing's not going to fit in your oven if you're standing it
Okay.
up.
So is there any dish that Thanksgiving time people cook with beer?
Ooh, what an interesting question. You certainly could sub beer for wine in your gravy. So you could put beer in your gravy. That would work.
And what would you use? A light beer or aromatic beer?
Probably something light. I mean, the aromatics are going to burn off when you cook it, so you're just going to be left with the maltiness. You don't want to do something that's too bitter because then that bitterness will be left behind. One of the main things that we look for in a wine to cook with is the acidity and the fruitiness, because kind of everything else is going to burn off. So you don't want something that's too bitter because the bitterness is going to linger. That's going to stick around. And we don't have necessarily the acidity. So I could go with something that is a little bit more malty and a little bit less bitter so that you get those kind of toasty flavors from the malt from the beer in your gravy. And the alcohol actually helps to awaken a lot of the chemical components in your dish. So different components dissolve in water. Some dissolve in water, some dissolve in alcohol. So that's one of the reasons why we like to use wine or beer as part of our gravies, because you actually make more complexity in your sauce if you use a little bit of alcohol. It then burns off, so you're not actually drinking it, but it's already done its job. So I would go with something that either has some fruitiness to it, so something that's a little bit more of a yeast forward style of beer, or something that has a little bit of toastiness. So like an English bitter would be lovely for that. Any of the German Dunkels that I was talking about before, or even if you have a leftover can of Oktoberfest, that would work really well as well, because those aren't particularly bitter and they've got that kind of toastiness to it. But as far as for other dishes, I mean, you could put some in your stuffing, I suppose. I've never really thought about cooking Thanksgiving sides or whatnot with beer.
Was there any other items you had on your list to discuss for Thanksgiving and beer and wine, or
I think I
that we
hit
missed?
all of my points. I had a whole long list and I think we talked about them all.
I think we covered pretty much all the main dishes again this year, and the leftovers. We did talk a lot of wine, so for the wine lovers out there, but we gave a lot more information about the beer knowledge from Kim, which I appreciated. Kim, was a lot of questions I personally had to ask you today,
That's
so
great.
I
I'm always here
appreciate
to
it.
answer your questions.
It was helpful. I'm still going to figure out how to stuff that can of turkey, so I'll figure that out. But anyway, so another year, another what to serve with the bird. Thank you, Kim, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family, and to all the listeners out there. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Yes, happy Thanksgiving, everyone. And we're approaching the end of the calendar year, and I hope you have had a good one this year. Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Mark Lenzi and Kim Simone. You can find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine, and all of our past episodes on SoundCloud and iTunes. Please leave us your questions and comments on our Facebook page. And remember that we are sponsored by Franklin Public Radio. Cheers.
Why, why?